Thanks for watching. I wanted to take a break from organizing my office, which you can see I've made a great deal of progress on from the last video, to talk about a trend that I noticed in the last couple of weeks whenever the Trump administration had to respond to questions on what is turning out to be purely inhumane immigration policies. When pressed on their rationale, Trump and his officials often made reference to the notorious street gang MS-13.
Together, we're going to restore safety to our streets and peace to our communities. And we're going to destroy the vile criminal cartel MS-13 and many other gangs.
But I'm referring, and you know I'm referring to the MS-13 gangs that are coming in. These are animals. They're coming into our country. We're getting them out. They come in again. We're getting them out. We need strong immigration laws. We have the weakest laws in the entire world.
They don't like shooting people because it's too quick. It's too fast. I was reading one of these animals was caught and explaining they like to knife them and cut them and let them die slowly because that way it's more painful and they enjoy watching that much more. These are animals.
This is one of the most vicious and deadly gangs that operates by the motto of rape, control, and kill. If the media and liberals want to defend MS-13, they're more than welcome to.
So yay, we have a new boogeyman, and Democrats want to protect them. Even better. Look, this is clearly ridiculous. Nobody wants to protect MS-13, and nobody's denying that this gang, like all gangs and criminal syndicates, is a real problem. But the Trump administration's reference to MS-13 is part of a larger issue. It's a rhetorical practice used to drum up support and silence opposition to otherwise indefensible immigration policies. Constantly referencing MS-13 is a rhetorical strategy that I refer to as the discourse of the other. The discourse of the other is a process by which social groups and reference groups like political parties, for instance, create a sense of group inclusion and exclusivity by applying stigmas to identifiable outgroups, oftentimes minority groups. This often involves making use of pre-existing stereotypes and easy-to-embrace scapegoating as a way to vilify and problematize a group identified as those people as distinct from us people. Now, this is nothing new. Even the rhetorical references to those people as animals is pretty old-school rhetoric. The first mass media application of the discourse of the other that I can think of comes out of the yellow journalism associated with the Spanish-American War. In this case, the Spanish were represented as ape-like beasts, violently oppressing the Cuban people and victimizing white women. Aside, protecting white women from those people is another common theme in the discourse of the other. This was pretty successful, so much so that we see almost the exact same bestial representations used in reference to Germans in World War I, in the first state-coordinated mass media propaganda campaign organized by the famous Creel Committee on Public Education. When the Great War ended, the lessons learned about the discourse of the other was then turned toward domestic conflicts. In the first Red Scare in the 1920s, the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Justice Department, under the leadership of A. Mitchell Palmer, demonized left-wing political groups and all but crushed the left until the Great Depression. This process was repeated after World War II to root out communists who were reportedly trying to undermine the American way of life by infiltrating our government and culture. The result was the infamous blacklist that suppressed some of America's greatest writers and artists, and McCarthyism, which destroyed the lives of hundreds of loyal public servants. When the Soviet Union fell and communism no longer held quite the boogeyman value it used to hold, the discourse of the other was applied to different groups. For decades, it was the terrorists. Now, under the Trump administration, we see a renaissance of the old know-nothing rhetoric attached to immigrants. This idea of the discourse of the other draws from the work of famed sociologist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois presented a theory describing the cultural elements of oppression. According to Du Bois, the dominant group in society, in his case, whites in the United States, perpetuated oppression through a combination of destroying the history of the oppressed people and controlling the representations of the oppressed. Destroying the history involves telling the history of the oppressed through the lens of the oppressor. In American history, I call this the great white man paradigm of history. So, for instance, slavery in the United States is presented as an unfortunate side note. Yeah, there was slaves. But Abraham Lincoln came along, a great white man, and solved the problem. The genocide of Native people. in American history textbooks is often referred to as Western expansion. There's plenty of examples of this, and I don't really want to get into an analysis of the history element of this, but I do want to talk more about controlling the representations. Controlling the representations is a bit more complex, and it's an issue we still have to deal with. In this case, the dominant group takes control of how the subordinate group is understood or represented to the larger society. This is done through controlling the discourse, or how we speak about issues, and controlling the signifiers, or the signs that we use to understand these different groups. By controlling how we understand certain groups in society, the dominant group also controls how the society responds to these subordinate groups. So, let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Pay attention to the pictures that pop up in your mind when I use certain terms. What images come to mind, for instance, when I use the term terrorist? The chances are pretty good that the image is a swarthy, Arabic-looking man with a turban. You may even see Osama bin Laden himself, who came to personify terrorism. What if I use the term gang member? What image comes to your mind? I would wager it's probably a male person of color, conspicuously black or Hispanic. Now, let's contrast this. What image comes to mind when I say doctor? You're probably seeing a middle-aged white male. Maybe you're seeing George Clooney. Regardless, it's probably not a man of color, and it's probably not a turbaned Arab. These are examples of representations. By representing or referencing MS-13 in terms of immigration, what the Trump administration is doing is constructing a representation of Southern immigrants as dangerous. And these representations then become the justifications for policies intended to protect us at the expense of them or those people. After all, you never really know about those people, do you? So in this case, how's the Trump administration controlling, and let's call it what it is, distorting the history and representations of immigrants by using MS-13 as a reference? After all, these representations are only being applied to those people from so-called shithole countries, not good white people from Northern Europe. In the case of MS-13, this history is largely being ignored, which, let's face it, equates to being erased. It's enough to say that it's a dangerous gang that just appeared because, well, those people. But MS-13 has a history associated with U.S. foreign policy and immigration policy. In the 1980s, President Reagan, and to be fair, he was following policy implemented by his predecessor, President Carter, stepped up support for the military junta running El Salvador against a Marxist uprising led by a left-wing coalition called the FMLN. He did this by providing military advisors and millions of dollars of economic and military aid to this brutal military dictatorship. The resulting civil war lasted 12 years and included brutal military repression, death squads, and assassination of popular leaders, including Archbishop Oscar Romero. As a result, hundreds of thousands of El Salvadorans left and continue to leave the instability resulting from that civil war. In the 90s, thousands of El Salvadorans sought refuge in the United States, often settling down in ethnic enclaves and communities with high poverty and low opportunities. As is often the case, people, especially young men in patriarchal cultures, living under such conditions are more likely to turn to gangs as proxies for building status, protection, and economic opportunities. In the 90s, the Clinton administration cracked down on immigrant communities, especially those associated with crime. And many El Salvadoran gang members were deported back to El Salvador, where communities were still unstable and the rule of law was hard-pressed. Of course, you have ambitious young men with violent gang experience and skill sets, and you put them in unstable, irrational communities, and there's few who can compete with them. The result was the development of a brutal international crime syndicate known as MS-13. To a certain extent, MS-13 is blowback from a previous crackdown on immigration, combined with our long discredited war on drugs that accomplishes nothing but making the drug market more lucrative for those who are violent enough to take on the risks. So how closely does MS-13 represent Central American immigrants? Turns out, not at all. In fact, according to statistics coming from the Department of Homeland Security, of over 114,000 individuals deported last year, just over 420 were associated with MS-13. That's 0.3%. Of 250,000 unaccompanied minors caught crossing the border since 2011, only 56 are suspected members of MS-13. MS-13 is not representative of Southern migrants. But if you listen to claims made by the administration and the conservative white noise machine, pun intended, you would think that because of the open border policies of the Obama administration, hordes of immigrants are pouring over the border uncontrolled. This is just simply not true. In fact, since 2000, the number of undocumented immigrants apprehended, which is a proxy for the number crossing the border, has been steadily declining. The number of undocumented immigrants in the United States declined slightly since around 2007 and has been pretty stable ever since. Over 60% of undocumented immigrants in the United States today have been here for at least 10 years. According to the Center for Migration Studies, over 40% of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. are those who entered legally and overstayed their visas. Over 60% of new undocumented immigrants are those who overstayed their visas. So why do they overstay? Well, there are rational reasons for doing so, but for the purposes of this video, I want to focus on those crossing the border. There simply is no good information for claiming that we're having some kind of migrant crisis at the border. The bottom line is that when we talk about people crossing the border with the appropriate papers or not, what we're talking about almost every time is people just like you and me, regular people who are living in desperate circumstances. Imagine what it would take to convince you to grab your family and make a long, arduous trek over hostile terrain and dangerous deserts in order to cross into another country with different customs and different language, knowing full well that you'll be consigned to some of the most difficult, arduous, and unhealthy jobs in the country. What would it take? In migration studies, we talk about pull factors, those factors that attract migrants, and push factors, those factors that encourage people to migrate. The pull factors are clear. Despite the problems we face in the United States, compared to life in destabilized nations in the Northern Triangle of Central America and rural Mexico, this country looks pretty good. Greater freedom, greater opportunities, work for which there's demand. All you have to do is deal with some bigoted know-nothing yahoos, though that's becoming a lot more complicated since, well, you know. People who are trying to cross the increasingly guarded border are those who are fleeing poverty, political oppression, criminal cartels, or domestic violence. They're turning to the United States for respite. They're not MS-13 members. Well, then you might ask, and in fact I hear this argument very often, if those people are so innocent, why don't they just come in legally like my ancestors did? This is another case where the history is being distorted. This is my great-grandfather Gaetano Andosha. He came to the United States legally in 1892. How did he do it? Well, he showed up. Yeah. That was a brief entrance interview and a physical to make sure he wasn't carrying a contagious disease, but was then welcomed into the country. Of course, among the know-nothings of the time, everyone understood that Italians were untrustworthy, criminally minded ruffians who would cut you as soon as look at you, but that was the process. In fact, unless you were Chinese, there were virtually no limitations on immigration to the United States until the 1920s. In the 1920s, quotas were added to stop those people from Europe who were undesirable, namely Italians, Jews, and other swarthy Southern and Eastern Europeans. Still, there were no limitations on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Many Mexican migrants enjoyed virtually open border, following the agricultural seasons. During World War II, in fact, Mexican migration was encouraged through the Bracero program. It wasn't until 1965 Immigration Act that caps on the number of immigrants were put in place. Today, it is very difficult for desperately poor people to immigrate into the United States legally. Without family connections, what the right decries as chain migration, the process is long and arduous. After filling the appropriate paperwork and paying the necessary fees, the prospective migrant's name gets put into a lottery. It could be years before an individual is allowed into the United States through the lottery. Think about that. Your children are starving now, and the best you can do legally is enter into a process that could take years. What do? Do you take a chance and hope for the best? For my kids? I would. I would absolutely cross that desert for my family. The second element of this that does not get mentioned specifically in the press quite the way I think it should is that it's perfectly legal for people to come to the border without papers and request asylum. The United States is a signatory of the 1967 UN Protocol, establishing the responsibilities toward people meeting the legal definition of a refugee. This protocol was enacted in the U.S. law with the Refugee Act of 1980, and yes, we are facing and will continue to face increasing numbers of refugees showing up at our borders and turning themselves in, requesting asylum. The 1967 protocol defines a refugee as a person who is unable or unwilling to return to his or her home country and cannot obtain protection in that country due to past persecution or well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Though just yesterday, the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions has decided that those fleeing drug cartels and domestic abuse do not qualify for refugee status. Figure that. It's also important to note that one cannot be a refugee from poverty. Even though we can argue that poverty is just as dangerous and oppressive and deadly as any drug cartel or tin horn dictator, nope. To escape poverty, you have to stand in line. Why do you suppose that is? Now, Donald Trump as a candidate and as president presented the refugee system as one in which thousands of potential terrorists were coming into the United States unchecked. His solution, other than the wall, was what he called extreme vetting. Well, a good look at the U.S. asylum process shows that we already have a pretty extreme vetting system in place. Asylum seekers are burdened with proving that they're fleeing violence. They are held in detention until their claims can be verified through multiple agencies. The process takes months, even years to complete before the refugee can take a free step into the United States. It's not like someone can just come to the border, claim to be a refugee, and they're given a lollipop and a welfare check and sent on their way. Yet many anti-immigrant pundits leave you with this impression. The reality is, if I were a terrorist or criminally inclined MS-13 member, the last thing I would want to do is enter the United States through the asylum process. So what are the consequences of this discourse of the other? Why do political operatives use such a rhetorical tactic? Well, the goal is always to dehumanize a particular group. The discourse of the other fabricates an inherent distinction between those people and us people by presuming that superficial characteristics and anecdotal evidence is an intrinsic representation of a whole population. First, by dehumanizing those people, it makes it easier to assume the worst from the group. When political operatives claim that immigrants bring crime, it's easy to just accept that without proof when we represent immigrants with groups like MS-13. The fact that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than natural-born citizens doesn't register. When conservatives insist that immigrants are coming to the United States in order to take advantage of our gracious welfare programs, it doesn't matter that one can't qualify for almost any social safety net programs without a valid social security number. Then when we see stories, and let's face it, with millions of undocumented immigrants, there's bound to be stories of some who are criminals, even violent criminals, or some who do manage to find their way on the welfare rolls. Those stories are held up as typifying examples of the whole population. And let's face it, as human beings, we embrace stories much better than we accept statistics. Stories are more concrete to us. Statistics are more abstract. Second, dehumanizing those people makes it easier to accept inhumane actions against them. Just recently, Now This posted a video of Border Patrol agents destroying water supplies used to keep people crossing who are crossing the desert from dying of dehydration. This isn't law enforcement. This is potentially killing people. But they're those people, so there didn't seem to be much regret on the part of the Border Patrol agents. But this cruel attitude is central to the conservative movement that propelled Trump into office. Don't get me wrong. Immigrants have always faced dehumanization when coming into the United States. Trump isn't the first of this breed. Anti-immigrant know-nothingism has always been a mainstay of American culture. My wife's Irish ancestors faced it. My Italian ancestors faced it. President Obama was heavily criticized from the left for stepping up deportation to the point where he was forced to make changes. Let's face it, deporting people into impoverished or oppressive conditions, sending them back to the drug cartels, is inhumane. Locking people up who've done nothing more than cross an imaginary line along a muddy river is inhumane. But this administration seems to be practicing an exceptionally high level of cruelty. Like I said earlier, the Sessions Justice Department has decided that those fleeing drug cartels or domestic violence will no longer have grounds for asylum. Stopping people from escaping gangs and domestic abuse is inhumane, especially when those refugees are children. Most recently, the Trump administration implemented what it calls a zero-tolerance policy for anyone crossing the border without the appropriate documents. The consequences of this is that minor children who cannot be prosecuted are being forcibly or dishonestly separated from their parents, who are being prosecuted. Remember, these are desperate people who've done nothing but cross an invisible line. We might note, also, that money is free to cross that imaginary line. Corporations can cross that line. Jobs can cross that line. Just not people. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani, condemned the United States, saying the U.S. should immediately halt this practice of separating families and stop criminalizing what should at most be an administrative offense, that of irregular entry or stay in the U.S. Lee Gellert of the American Civil Liberties Union claims that over 1,000 children have been separated from their parents in the last 5 weeks. Furthermore, these dehumanizing policies do nothing to resolve the very problems that their advocates claim they want to address. They only serve to make life more miserable and more dangerous for those who are already victimized by inhuman systems of political economy. That's because they do nothing to address the underlying causes of the problem, namely the push factors driving people to take their chances by crossing the border without documents. If anything, they compound the very poverty and corruption and misery that drives migrants and refugees to begin with. If the United States wants to stem immigration and the refugee crisis, there are only two possible solutions. First, we can work to help stabilize and develop resources in the struggling nations that are the sources of migration. Ending the drug war would go a long way toward that end, as would supporting local democratic movements over pro-corporate right-wing dictatorships. The alternative is simply barbaric. The other solution is to escalate the level of inhumanity and oppression that migrants already face coming into the United States. As has been admitted by the administration, separating children from their families is a feature, not a bug of this system. The idea is to dissuade refugees from coming to the United States. That's not going to work. After all, for many families, the prospects of their children being taken into custody by the U.S. government is less of a threat than the prospects of their children being killed or sold into slavery by the cartels. If you want to dissuade refugees, you have to create a system that is more brutal than the cartels, the corruption, and the poverty that they're fleeing. But this policy is not something that one human being can do to another human being. Dehumanizing the other is the only way to justify this kind of inhumanity to our brothers and sisters across the border. Listen, the fact is, as a nation, we need to make sound, fact-based, and morally defensible decisions with regard to human beings who see the United States as the beacon of freedom and opportunity it has always promised to be. Immigrants contribute to our economy, and let's face it, with current fertility and longevity trends and aging American workforce, we need more young people in our country. At the same time, we do have to address issues of crime, terrorism, and allocation of resources to newcomers to our country. But these aren't insurmountable issues. We already have a system of due process for dealing with crime. We have laws and agencies specialized in bringing down crime syndicates like MS-13. In fact, according to experts, MS-13 has already been declining from a peak of 10,000 members to just around 6,000 today. If we want to do something about undocumented immigrants, we might want to make it easier to get the documents, not more difficult. If we want to do something about refugees, we might want to dedicate our foreign policy to creating less refugees, rather than destabilizing regions for what we call the national interest. Dehumanizing and immiserating human beings because they represent the other, or those people, is not a mark of a free, civilized, or courageous people. It's the mark of xenophobia and moral cowardice.